last week. So when you are dealing with angles that are greater than 360 or less than negative 360, what you want to do is you want to find a positive coterminal angle between 0 and 360 so you know exactly where that angle falls on the unit circle. So what I'm going to do for 420 degrees is I'm going to subtract 360. So 420 minus 360 is going to give me 60 degrees. So the cosine then of 420 degrees is going to have to be exactly the same as the cosine of 60 degrees. So that's why you want to make sure you're comfortable with those positive coterminal angles. So then, what is the cosine of 60 degrees looking at your unit circle? It's what? 1/2. So if you're dealing with angles greater than 2 pi or less than negative 2 pi, you find that positive coterminal angle to get that location on the unit circle. All right, let's take a look at 17 pi over 4. So now it's in radians. So now remember, in radians, 2 pi is equivalent to an angle with something over 4. How can I rewrite 2 pi with a denominator of 4? 8 pi over 4. So then you agree with me that 17 pi over 4 is larger than 8 pi over 4, correct? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 17 pi over 4 and I'm going to subtract 8 pi over 4. What is 17 pi over 4 minus 8 pi over 4? 9 pi over 4. Is that still larger than 2 pi? Yes. So what am I going to have to take away from 9 pi over 4? Again, I'm going to subtract a what? Subtract another 2 pi or 8 pi over 4. So 9 pi over 4 minus 8 pi over 4 is going to give me a pi over 4. So now let's talk about the cotangent of 17 pi over 4, which is the same as the cotangent of pi over 4. So I know pi over 4 is in quadrant 1. So I had you fill out the tangents on that original unit circle. What is the tangent of pi over 4? 1. What's the reciprocal of 1? 1. So if the tangent of pi over 4 is 1, what's the cotangent of pi over 4? 1. So it's just going to be 1. So any questions on that one? Secant of 29 pi over 6. So now let's look at 2 pi with a denominator of 6. How could I rewrite 2 pi with a denominator of 6? That's going to be equivalent to what? 12 pi over 6. How many times am I going to have to take away 12 pi over 6? Well, if I subtract 12 pi from 29 pi, what's that going to give me? 29 minus 12. 17. Am I still greater than 12 pi over 6? Yeah. So I'll have to subtract 12 pi over 6 again. So it's going to be 5 pi over 6 exactly. So the secant of 29 pi over 6 is going to be the same as the secant of 5 pi over 6. Now remind me again, secant is reciprocal of what function? Cosine. So the first thing you want to do is figure out what's the cosine of 5 pi over 6. So looking on your unit circle, what is the cosine? Negative square root 3 over 2. So to find the secant, what am I going to have to do with this negative square root of 3 over 2? I'm going to have to take the what? Reciprocal. So it's going to be negative 2 over square root 3. And again, we're not going to leave a radical in the denominator, so we're going to have to rationalize this. So this is going to rationalize to negative 2 square root 3 over 3. It would be very helpful if you remember the reciprocals of square root of 3 over 2 is 2 square root 3 over 3 because it comes up all the time when you're doing secants and cosecants. All right? So any questions on how I found the secant?
How is it actually what you're trying to find?
Yeah, find the sine cosine first, and then you take the reciprocal if you're doing a secant or a cosecant. Look at the tangent of negative 3 pi over 2. Now, if you're really comfortable doing negative angles, where is negative 3 pi over 2 located on the unit circle? Negative 3 pi over 2 is located where? It's right up here at pi over 2, correct? So you agree with me that negative 3 pi over 2 is in exactly the same location as pi over 2. If you're not comfortable with that, remember 2 pi is equivalent to 4 pi over 2, correct? So you can still find that positive coterminal angle between 0 and 2 pi. But instead of subtracting 2 pi, I would want to add 2 pi. So negative 3 pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2, notice it puts me right at pi over 2. Okay? So then the tangent of negative 3 pi over 2 is equal to the tangent of pi over 2. So if you're not comfortable with the negative angles, just add 360 or add 2 pi until you get to an angle between 0 and 360 or 0 and 2 pi. Some of you are more comfortable visualizing the negative angles than others. So you don't have to find those positive coterminal angles if you're comfortable with where those negative angles are located. Yes, Jen?
Do we add instead of subtracting because it was negative?
Yeah. Yeah, because the unit circle, when we filled it out, remember, it's only dealing with positive angles. You're only going from 0 to 360 or 0 to 2 pi. Okay? So what is the tangent of pi over 2? Remember, tangent is y over x. So if you look at the ordered pair over here on at pi over 2, you end up with the ordered pair is 0, 1, correct? So that's going to be 1 over 0, which means it's going to be undefined. Okay? So now, you guys try E for me. Secant's reciprocal of what function? Cosine. And if you need to, you can know, if you know where negative 3 pi over 4 is located, you don't have to do the negative square root 2. Guys, make sure you're careful of those negatives. So negative square root 2. So any questions when you're dealing with angles that are not necessarily between 0 and 360 or 0 and 2 pi, how you can actually figure out exactly the location on the unit circle? Again, you can find the positive coterminal angle to help you get that location if you don't know what it is. Guys, go ahead and do F for me. Cosecant's reciprocal of what? Sine. So now the question is, where is negative 5 pi over 6 going to be located? What quadrant? 3. It's going to be 3. You're going to be at the pi over 6 family down there in quadrant 3. So what is this going to be in letter F? What is the cosecant of negative 5 pi over 6? Negative 2. Okay? Any questions on that? Now sometimes, like I said, you have other operations. You've got to fill values in and do some adding and subtracting. So take a look at number 2. So on the unit circle, we want to find the exact value of the following. I want to figure out what the sine of 30 minus cosine of 45 degrees is going to be. First of all, from the unit circle, you've got to figure out what is the sine of 30. So looking on your unit circle, what is the sine of 30? Sine of 30 is 1/2 minus, what is the cosine of 45 degrees? The cosine of 45 degrees is square root 2 over 2. So 1 minus square root 2 all over 2. All you can do is condense that to a single fraction. Luckily, the denominators are already the same. But remember, you cannot take a number that's not under a radical and subtract it from a number that is under a radical. So that's as simplified as you can go. All right, take a look at B. So now let's find the tangent of 45 degrees. What's the tangent of 45 degrees? 1. Times, what's the cosine of 30 degrees? Square root 3 over 2. And what is 1 times square root 3 over 2? Square root 3 over 2. So like I said, you just pull the values off the unit circle and then you perform the operations. Let's talk about the secant of pi. Well, secant's reciprocal of what trig function? Cosine. So the question is, what's the cosine of pi? Remember, remind me again, is cosine the x or the y? X. So the cosine of pi is what? Negative 1. What's the reciprocal of negative 1? What's the reciprocal of negative 1? Negative 1. Just remember, negative 1 over 1 is just going to be 1 over 1 again. Minus. Now let's talk about the cosecant of pi over 2. Well, cosecant is reciprocal of what function? Sine. So the sine of pi over 2. Sine of pi over 2 again is 1. Because remember, sine is the y coordinate. What is the reciprocal of 1? The reciprocal of 1 over 1 is going to be 1. So what is negative 1 minus 1? Negative 2. Now remember, 3 is a coefficient. It's just being multiplied. You're just multiplying. Plus whatever the cotangent of pi over 4 is going to be. So now let's talk about cosecant of pi over 3. Cosecant's reciprocal of what? Sine. So now the question is, what's the sine of pi over 3? The sine of pi over 3 is what? Square root 3 over 2. Cotangent of pi over 4. Well, the tangent of pi over 4 is what? 1. And what's the reciprocal of 1? 1.
Cosecant of pi over 3 would still be 2 pi over 3, or 2 pi.
So
Square root
the sine of pi over 3 is square root 3 over 2, but yes, you're right, we have to take the reciprocal of that. So again, we do have to take the reciprocal of that. So again, because this is the sine of pi over 3, correct? So that's going to be 2 over square root 3 plus 1.
So where did you put it from?
Cotangent of pi over 4. So look at pi over 4. What's the tangent of pi over 4? The tangent of pi over 4 is just 1. And the reciprocal of 1 is 1.
So you still have to rationalize.
Yes, we still have to rationalize it. Yep. Yeah. Are we good so far where I found these values? So now, it's up to you. This is kind of an eeny, meeny, miny, mo. When I multiply, what's the denominator for 3? The denominator for 3 is a what? 1. How do you multiply fractions together? You just multiply straight across. So this is going to give me 6 over square root 3 plus 1. And now when I rationalize this, this is going to give me 6 square root 3 over 3 plus 1. Can I simplify 6 square root 3 over 3? Yes, that simplifies to what? 2 times square root 3 plus 1. Okay? So like I said, you can use those values from the unit circle, and you may have other operations to perform. All right, find the values off the unit circle and then do the calculations. Yeah, Sophie.
So where you have the 3 over 1 times the 2 over the square root 3, how come you don't have to multiply the square root 3? And
If you rationalize in the beginning, that's fine.
Okay.
You can either, so it's kind of an eeny, meeny, miny, mo, whichever you feel more comfortable with. You can rationalize before you multiply, or I multiplied and then rationalized.
Okay.
You'll get the same answer either way.
Okay.
Okay? So any questions on that? So now let's find the exact value of the 6 trig function. So again, we're still looking at the unit circle. Again, remind me again, x goes with what trig function? Cosine. Y goes with the sine. So let's start off, let's first figure out what the sine of 5 pi over 6 is. So looking on the unit circle, what is the sine of 5 pi over 6? 1/2. And again, I'm in quadrant 2, so I know it's positive. Well, if I know the sine, I can find the cosecant. So what's the reciprocal of 1/2? 2. So now let's talk about the cosine. The cosine of 5 pi over 6 is negative square root 3 over 2. Again, remember it's the x coordinate at 5 pi over 6. So then if I know cosine, I know the secant. So now the big question is, what's the reciprocal of negative square root 3 over 2? Negative 2 square root 3 over 3. It's very helpful to remember so you're not constantly flipping and rationalizing that the reciprocal of negative square root 3 over 2 is that negative 2 square root 3 over 3. So now let's talk about the tangent. Remember I told you the tangent trick. How many 3's make up a 6? 2. So the tangent of any family with that denominator of 6 is going to have the 2 3's in it. So it's going to be square root of 3 over 3. Now the thing you have to figure out though, is this going to be positive or is it going to be negative? Negative. Because remember, you're all students take calculus, only sine is positive in quadrant 2. And then the cotangent. So I have to take the cotangent of 5 pi over 6. Well, the big question is, what's the reciprocal of square root 3 over 3? Square root 3. So it's going to be negative square root 3. Remember, always double check your all students take calculus, guys. I can't emphasize this enough. Before you move on to the next problem. Because if you miss negatives, you're looking at missing a -4 on this problem before I even look at any of your fractions. The only two trig functions should be sine and cosecant. Everything else better have a negative sign in front of it. So those negative signs can be very costly when I ask you a question like this. So always refer back to your all students take calculus to make sure you have your negative signs in place. Let's take a look at 13 pi over 4. Is that greater than 2 pi? Yes. So if I subtract 2 pi from this, which is equivalent to 8 pi over 4, 13 pi over 4 minus 8 pi over 4 is going to give me what? 5 pi over 4. So I know that the 6 trig functions are going to have exactly the same value as 5 pi over 4. So now you guys go ahead for me and find the 6 trig functions at 5 pi over 4. Again, the reciprocal of negative square root 2 over 2 is negative square root 2. And then sine and cosine will have the same values along with the cosecant and the secant. Tangent, remember, you're down here in quadrant 3, so tangent is +1, cotangent is also +1. The other 4 need to be negative. All right, so any questions on finding the 6 trig values of those? Tan. You agree with me that x and y are the same?
Yeah.
All right, so anytime you take a number and divide it by itself, it's always 1. We'll talk about the quotient identity in a minute, which will emphasize that again to you. Okay. Negative 5 pi. On the unit circle, where is the location going to be for negative 5 pi? It's going to be at negative. It's going to be at which angle? It's going to be the same as what? Pi. Because again, I can add 6 pi. I can add 2 pi 3 times. So if I add 6 pi, that's going to put me at pi, which, like you were mentioning, is the ordered pair -1, 0. So now let's talk about the sign of negative 5 pi. Sine is your y-coordinate, so sine is going to be equal to 0. Let's talk about its reciprocal cosecant. I mentioned this again. What is the reciprocal of 0? No. Undefined. Remember, 0 is the only number that does not have a reciprocal. So anytime you have to take the reciprocal of 0, it's undefined. Remember, it is okay to get a 0, you have to have a 0 in the numerator. It is okay to have a 0 in the numerator. But when I flip this, it is a no-no to have a 0 in the denominator. So I know it's undefined. So 0 is the only number in our number system that does not have a reciprocal. It is undefined. So now let's talk about the cosine. What's the cosine of negative 5 pi then going to be? -1. So then the secant of negative 5 pi is going to be what? -1. So let's talk about the tangent. Remember, tangent is y over x. So then what's the tangent of -5 pi going to be? 0. Because 0 divided by -1 is 0. So then what's the cotangent? Undefined. There you go. Okay? So any questions when you're dealing with trying to take the reciprocal of 0 where it's going to be undefined or not? Remember, reciprocal of 1 is just 1. All right? This is kind of an identity that we're going to talk about a lot. Like I've been mentioning, tangent is y over x. Remind me again what trig function goes with y? Sine. So then another way I could look at this is tangent is equal to sine of theta over cosine theta. You will have that memorized. That is something we're going to use all semester. Tangent is sine over cosine, just like it's y over x. Well, if tangent is y over x, cotangent I know is x over y. So then what's cotangent in terms of my trig functions? Cotangent is going to be the cosine of theta over sine theta. Okay. So now let's take a look at, so by just knowing sine and cosine, you can find the other 4 trig functions, because now you know that tangent is sine over cosine. So I'm giving you sine and cosine. We want to find the exact value of the other 4. So, well, first of all, what function is reciprocal of the sine? Cosecant. So cosecant of theta is going to be negative 5 over square root 5. And when I rationalize that, that's going to give me negative 5 square root 5 over 5, which reduces to what? Negative square root 5. Secant. Secant's reciprocal of the cosine. So I just simply have to take the reciprocal of negative 2 square root 5 over 5. How do I rationalize this? I'm going to multiply the top and bottom by what? Square root 5. So I have negative 5 square root 5 over, what is 2 square root 5 times square root 5? 10. Can I simplify that fraction? Negative square root 5 over 2. So any questions if I give you sine and I give you cosine, how you can find the secant or the cosecant? So now let's talk about the tangent. Remember, tangent, I'm going to take the sine, which again they're giving me as negative square root 5 over 5, and I'm going to divide it. Remember, I can write division 1 of 2 ways. I can write division vertically like it's written up here, or I can write it out horizontally, can I? So if I'm going to take sine and divide it by cosine, and since I'm dealing with fractions, it's much easier to write this division problem out horizontally. So I'm going to take negative square root of 5 over 5, and I'm going to divide it by negative 2 square root 5 over 5. My next question to you is this. How do you divide fractions? You have to do what? Multiply by the reciprocal. Which fraction do I flip, the first one or the second one? Second.
Where did you get negative 5? Or how did you get the first fraction?
This is just my sine. Remember, it's sine divided by cosine. That's just my square root. My pen kind of, sorry, my pen kind of slipped on me. So now I can cross-cancel the 5s, cross-cancel the radical 5. So what's this tangent actually going to simplify down to? It simplifies down to a nice number, negative 1 over 2. Or if you want to write it as one big fraction, you can. Well, if tangent's negative 1/2, what's the cotangent? Negative 2 over 1, or just negative 2. Okay?
Wait. No, 1 over 2. Yeah, would it be positive?
Oh, yes, positive. Positive, thank you. Positive 1 over 2. Yep, a negative times a negative is a positive. Thank you. Okay. Any questions on that one? You guys go ahead and try B for me. Four other trig functions again. When you rationalize 2 square root 2 over 3, hopefully you came up with 3 square root 2 over 4. Secant, again, reciprocal of negative 1/3 is just negative 3. So any questions on finding the cosecant or secant? Yeah, Philip.
For the tangent, I thought cosine was x and sine was y. So it wouldn't be like,
So it's tangent is sine over cosine or y over x. So remember, it's always sine over cosine or y over x. You probably have the cotangent and tangent stuff then, if you did that. Yeah. So then when I do the tangent, remember, I'm going to take my sine, and I'm going to divide it by the cosine, which means I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal of negative 1/3, which is negative 3. And then when I take the reciprocal of negative 2 square root of 2 to find the cotangent, I rationalize to negative square root 2 over 4. So any questions on those? Now, if you have your calculators, you may also have problems that involve decimals where you'll have to use your calculator. So if I give you, instead of fractions, I give you decimals. Well, to find the cosecant, what's the reciprocal of this decimal? What's the reciprocal of 0.6428? 1 over. All you do is take 1 over 0.6428. So the cosecant is just going to be 1 divided by 0.6428. So on my calculator, that's exactly what I'm going to type in. 1 divided by the sine, 1 divided by 0.6428. So 1.556. So the secant, I'm just going to take 1 divided by this cosine value. So 1 divided by 0.7660. Which gives me 1.305. So any questions if I give you decimals instead of fractions? How you can find the secant or the cosecant? So now tangent, I know is the sine, which is 0.6428, divided by the cosine, which is 0.7660. So I'll just divide those two numbers, 0.6428 divided by 0.7660. So about 0.839. Remember, you always round it to 3 decimal places. So any questions how I found the tangent? The cotangent, you can just take the reciprocal of 0.839, or you could just take the reciprocal of the tangent, the 0.7660, and divide it by 0.6428. So about 1.192. So any questions, guys? If I give you sine and cosine, but instead of being fractions or decimals, you have to use your calculators to find them. Okay? Last thing and we're done, which I definitely want to go over because some of you had issues with this on the quiz. I call this the tree tic-tac-toe. So now, find cotangent if tangent of theta is negative square root 3 and cosine is less than 0. You've got to know your location, ladies and gentlemen, and some of you missed this on the quiz. So the question is, you've got to know what quadrants your trig functions are positive and negative. Well, first of all, right away, we know that tangent is negative, correct? So what quadrant could I be in? Where is tangent negative? What 2 quadrants would tangent be negative in? 2 and 4. So right away I can eliminate 1 and 3. So I know that this answer cannot be in 1 and 3. Does everybody agree with me on that? So now the last statement is going to help me narrow it down to which one of the 2. Cosine is less than 0. What does that mean about cosine? Is it positive or negative? Negative. So if cosine is negative, out of 2 and 4, where am I allowed to be? 2. So I know I have to be in quadrant 2. All right? So now I know I have to be in quadrant 3. So if tangent is negative square root of 3, what's the cotangent going to be? Well, what's the relationship? What can I do with negative square root 3? Take the what of negative square root 3? Take the reciprocal. So cotangent of theta is going to be negative 1 over square root 3, which is going to give me negative square root 3 over 3. But had this been another trig function, you would have had to make sure you knew your location. Look at example 6. Find cosine if cosecant is negative 2 square root 3 over 3 and cotangent is greater than 0. Get your location down. So what do I know about cosecant? Cosecant is negative. Cosecant is reciprocal of what function? Sine. So the question is, where is sine negative? 3 and 4. So I can eliminate 1, I can eliminate 2. And they're telling me that cotangent is greater than 0, which tells me cotangent's positive. So out of these two quadrants, where is cotangent and tangent positive? 3. Well, cosecant is reciprocal of what function? Cosecant is reciprocal of the sine. So what is the reciprocal of negative 2 square root 3 over 3? Because this is going to be a unit circle value. Hopefully you may recognize what the reciprocal of this is by the end of today. Negative square root 3 over 2. So now the question is, I want to find the cosine in quadrant 3. So first of all, is cosine positive or negative in quadrant 3? What's happening with the cosine? Negative. Well, I know that sine is my y-coordinate. So looking on your unit circle, if my sine is negative square root 3 over 2, what's the cosine value going to have to be? Negative 1/2. And there's your answer. Okay? But always make sure, guys, you establish that location and you got that location down. All right, so any questions on